Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Mariana Garcia. I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the Connecticut's Old State House, and I want to welcome you all to the third and final installment in our Untangling the Tally series, look into the election process. The mission of the Connecticut Democracy Center is to inspire and provide people with a lifetime pathway to active citizenship and the tools they need to take civic action in their own communities. Elections are the cornerstone of a healthy civic life, and that's why we created this series now in the lead up to the 2022 elections in order to take a deep dive into the election process and to help voters feel more well-prepared and confident when it is time for them to head to the polls. Today's program will focus on the barriers to voting. Every year, millions of eligible voters find it near impossible to cast their votes and have their voices heard. The reasons why this is so are unique to every individual, but our program today will examine some of these barriers and where we can find them here in our state of Connecticut. We have a wonderful panel of experts here to talk to us about these barriers to voting. But before that, let me introduce you to our moderator for today, Val Ramos, who is the Director of Strategic Alliance and the Equity Officer at Everyday Democracy since December 2010. He also coordinates the Connecticut Civic Health Project, working with a strong advisory group. Previously, Val served as Director of Constituent Affairs for Connecticut State Secretary of the State Susan Bysowitz, where he handled constituent outreach and services, public policy research and legislative affairs, minority business development projects, and Latino voter outreach. Val has also has extensive expertise in the fields of public and higher education and arts programming and advocacy, and has served on over 25 community and leadership boards. Before we start the program, I hope that everybody watching online is able to
wanting to know and being more informed on their rights and access to the information and access to the polls.
Thank you, Doris. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Steve?
Well, thank you so much, Val, firstly. My name is Steven Hernandez. I am the executive director of a legislative agency that really does focus on equity and opportunity for the state of Connecticut. It's a nonpartisan agency of the legislature. We happen to be the home of the, as we were discussing, the Parent Leadership Training Institute, which is essentially a democracy school for families. And what's remarkable about the Parent Leadership Training Institute is that it recognizes that what parents share is that desire to leave a better world for their children. That is written into the promise that parents make to their children. And sharing that in common and understanding the tools of democracy that are necessary in order to move agenda on behalf of children is really the crux of the educational experience that the PLTI provides. Another way in which the Commission promotes civic engagement is that we do, of course, understand that this is a representative democracy, but that does not mean that the voice, the direct voice and the lived experience of people shouldn't be at every single table where decisions are being made about them. So that's a little bit about what we do. We also, of course, advise the legislature in both chambers in a nonpartisan way on issues that impact families.
Muchas gracias. Thank you,
Gracias a
Steve. Yanidsi.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege to be amongst such great panel and also here live with the audience. My name is Yanidsi Vélez. I'm the New England Regional Director at Hispanic Federation. The Hispanic Federation is a national nonprofit organization that empowers and advances the Latino community. Here in the state of Connecticut, most recently, we have been working in empowering other BIPOC organizations as well. And specifically around the civic engagement work that we do, it's very intrusive with every single core of our programs. We provide direct services, capacity building trainings and development for nonprofit organizations, and also advocacy. As a nonpartisan organization, we aim to really educate, engage the community, and to give them the tools and the opportunity to really be at the table, and more importantly, to take advantage of the timing that we're living in. In the state of Connecticut, we have a crucial question in the ballot, and as part of our campaign, is to really send messaging, send phone calls, and work directly with the local nonprofit organizations that are serving our communities so they can be as the trusted voices, so they can be also educated on the issues. For us, it's a great privilege to be one of those trusted voices within the community. We are recognized at the national level, state level, and regional level. And for us, it's really to make sure that everyone gets out to vote in the midterm elections and in the presidential elections.
Thank you, Yanidsi. Gracias. Joe.
Thank you so much. Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Appreciate being here. So I am a social studies teacher at the moment, and before I forget, I promised my students I'd give them a shout out. So hi to E.O. Smith High School, and if the kids are watching right now on their phones, put them away if you're in class. But I've been teaching for 13 years, and before I was a teacher, and I should say that I've been a civics teacher for almost the entirety of that time teaching. But before I was a teacher, I was very passionate around politics, political science major at UConn, and after I graduated from UConn, I took on a role as the UConn College Democrats campus coordinator, and my job was to register students to vote. So we were going through and we knocked on something like 12,000 student dorm rooms to register voters. It seemed like it was going to be a close election. We didn't realize how close it would be. It came down to 93 or 83 votes. Who's counting, right? It was a very close election. So that was very exciting and sort of reinforced my passion for civic engagement. And then later on, I went to work at the state capitol for a couple of years, and I ended up working in the Senate President Pro Tem's office. So certainly a lot of connection there.
Thank you, Joe. I remember meeting Donald Williams when I used to work for Secretary of the State, Susan Vice, then Secretary of the State, Susan
Yes.
Vice. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's start this conversation. I think one thing I want to mention is that in 2022, the cost of voting index, which, by the way, I had not heard of this academic study. So I learned something new. Every day you learn something new. It's a nonpartisan academic study that analyzes the effort required to cast a ballot in each state, right? And Connecticut ranks number 30 in the nation, number 30. This study takes many factors into considerations, including ease of voter registration and average time spent waiting in line at the polls. That's probably one of the reasons why Connecticut didn't do so well, right? Despite this, a record 1.86 million Connecticut residents voted in the 2020 election, right? Nearly 80% of registered voters in the state. So I have a question for Yanidsi, and maybe Steve, you can also join in the answer. From your perspective, Yanidsi, why is Connecticut in the bottom half for how hard it is to vote here? And the second question is, anything you would like, I'll ask Steve the same question. Yanidsi.
Well, I believe that the state of Connecticut has been historically recognized as a state that had strict voter laws that do not facilitate the full participation of voters to participate in the electoral process. Part of that, it's the long waits. And also we need to take into consideration that while we have some limitations for the entire state, some of the communities, like the BIPOC communities, Latinx communities in particular, are more affected by by those decisions that are made by our elected officials and the constitution that has not changed to favor the voter participation of these communities in particular. Waiting line, I would like to say that if you compare Black and Latinos versus the white comport neighborhoods, they wait 30 minutes more than the regular average voter. And that led voters to really feel like I can go easy out of the line. Like they are not motivated to stay. Also, another issue is the language access that has really affected throughout the years to really empower other people who speak other languages, not only Spanish, which is one of the main foreign language speaking here in the state of Connecticut, but also Chinese, Portuguese. These individuals who are eligible voters really don't see themselves represented in the poll places or in their communities, or for that matter, even electoral or leadership representation. And when they go there, they want to be informed. They want to have access to the information in their own language so they can feel fully engaged in the process and confident in the process. So for those two main reasons, but I will say also that people don't have all the access to it because we don't have early voting. And I'm sure that we will talk more about that, I hope so, because really that's one of the things that is affecting our communities in particular to go in larger numbers to turn out to vote. The lacking of transportation, access to get out of work, when you're not working in the polling place, like things like that really affects the intentionality of a voter to cast their ballots. And to really, it's not that they don't make it priority, is that it's really hard to get out to vote in the state of Connecticut.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yanidsi. Steve, you want to add anything?
I really appreciate the distinction that you drew between the structural barriers to voting, which are myriad, but also the real honest to goodness question I think people ask, why does it matter to me? Why should I be engaged? And what we realize by asking that question is voting and the act of voting should be the culmination of a series of relationships that happen throughout the life and the year of a person. And if that person feels disengaged, that they have difficulty reaching their elected officials on any given day, if they don't have the ability to carve out part of their day, right, to engage civically because of all the pressures that they may be experiencing, the question inevitably comes to, why does it matter to me? How am I going to make a difference? And that commitment to why it matters to you, and the commitment of removing structural barriers, is a commitment that policymakers need to make first and foremostly, and everything else, right? The safety, the integrity, all of those things follow. First and foremostly is a commitment to access.
Thank you, Steve. I want to give Doris the opportunity to maybe add some comments on that. Doris?
Thank you very much. Overall in the U.S., voter turnout in 2022 decreased lower than 7% for voters with disabilities than voters without disabilities. Access, inclusion, and transportation. In the middle of a pandemic, we've always had transportation issues. We face discrimination biases, and we're ostracized because of our disabilities, and further ostracized if we're from a marginalized community. We remain the marginalized of the marginalized. This administration has not only discriminated against and unfairly burdened individuals with disabilities, but it perpetuates discrimination against people with disabilities, as experienced with COVID, when our people were refused entry into medical facilities with our caregivers and PCAs. We were then afforded the opportunity of receiving the vaccine, and against CDC guidelines and the ADA, this administration changed their minds the days before and denied access to people with disabilities and those immunocompromised. We feel rightfully disenfranchised. I've witnessed leaders boasting about institutionalization despite its inefficiency and failure to serve individuals with an equal right to live successfully in a community setting. Do your legislators have experiences with disabled peers? Mine don't. President Roosevelt became disabled with polio and was generally photographed from above the waist to avoid that stigma then. What is compelling us now if we are not reflected by the leadership we vote to empower?
Thank you so much, Doris. Obviously, we have already addressed many of the barriers. And one thing that we've all noticed is that there are people who always don't understand why people of color turn out to vote. And we talked about some of the barriers here. Any other barriers that you think? And I know, Joe, you're going to talk about civics education later on. But you want to talk a little bit about that right now as a barrier, and then later you'll elaborate more?
Sure. I work in a social studies department, and so I look at this issue through a history lens too. And I got here a little bit early, and I was walking through Hartford, and I walked down to the statue of Abraham Lincoln shaking the hand of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it reminded me that it wasn't that long ago in the scope of history that we fought a civil war over, ultimately this issue of equality and how we look at it. And I think that ripples through history, and I don't think the issues of that war were settled when the war ended, right? So I think we're still dealing with this legacy in history. I also think the question was a really good one that in order for people to vote, or the point was a really good one, that in order for people to vote, they have to be motivated to vote. So education plays an absolutely critical role there. And that's why I'm really proud that Connecticut has mandated civics education. I think we're going to get to this more later, but we require all of our students to have at least a half a year of civics education before they graduate. Very important to give students a reason to vote, to understand what their role is in our democracy.
Yes, and that was passed, I believe, in 2015, right?
I think that's right.
2014.
Yeah.
And clearly, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed over the years working with the Civic Health Project, for example, and others, Sally Whipple is a member of the Civic Health Project, is that for communities of color, civics learning has not been, there hasn't been a lot of opportunities for civics learning for students of color in Connecticut. And I think that that's a disparity that has been inherent systematically because of the focus on, especially for students of color, on reading and writing and math, of course, bringing up, sort of narrowing the achievement gap, right? But there's always a price to pay, and unfortunately for these children, civics education has been something that they have had to pay, a price they've had to pay for that. So thanks. I know you'll talk more about that later, of course. But let me turn now to to language access and information in different languages. Because you mentioned that, Yanidsi. And one thing that you probably know is that in 2020, the U.S. Bureau of the Census notified 10 Connecticut towns and cities that they had to provide bilingual voting assistance to those who need it because the population met the minimum requirements of non-native English-speaking voters to make it a requirement, right? So why is this necessary? Why is it so important for the state to provide language assistance to non-English speakers?
Well, because it is essential, a pathway to full voter participation. When we see the population that has grown in the state of Connecticut from the Latino community and other minority groups, without a doubt, we need to make sure that citizens, U.S. citizens, who would not necessarily feel comfortable with the English language as first language to read, to understand, to really carve the information that makes sense to them, and then be able to cast their ballot with a full conscience. It is important that we provide not only language access, but the correct language access. I mean, Spanish or Spanish from Spain is not the same from the Caribbean. It needs to be cultural competent, really need to have a sense of intentionality behind it. I per se come from Puerto Rico, born and raised, and I have been here for around 17 years. For the first 15 years, my work was actually register people to vote, educate them, to help them to become citizens, U.S. citizens. And what I really learned is that people love this country. People are committed to the future of this country and the future of their family. So if they already have gone through the whole process to become U.S. citizens, or even those who are second generation and they're left here and not necessarily they, grown with that English language at home, why not to provide them the full access to the electoral process? I think it's a right, and more important, it's the commitment, it's the law. And that's why that must continue to be a priority for every state. And more importantly, this time,
One of the big reasons for that was that no excuse absentee ballot voting was accessible in that election around the country because the pandemic was going on. So it was easier, the hurdles were lower for young people to vote. The other reason, and I think it's a factor, was definitely that there was a lot of interest in that particular election. People were very passionate about that election. But still, we have to remember that voter turnout among people 24 and younger in Connecticut was, I think, 52 or 54%. So we live in a democracy, and it's based on the principle of popular sovereignty. And when we're looking at the pool of voters in our elections, we're talking about in most of our elections, because most of our elections are not presidential elections, the majority of our elections, we actually have a minority of the electorate that's voting in our elections. And young people are unfortunately a large percentage of the reason that total percent isn't higher. So why are young people not voting more? One of it is the ballot access issue. Another, I think, is this issue of background and exposure to elections. I think a lot of and this isn't showing up in polling, I don't think, because if young people are asked, why don't you vote on election day, a lot of the time they're saying things that are very true. The lines are long, or they don't feel like the candidates on the ballot speak to them. But I think there's another issue going on that I think we don't do enough in education to expose young people to what elections actually look like. I think we contain our civics education too much in the walls of the classroom, and I think the learning, the content is very important, but I think we need to do more to actually expose young people to firsthand, witnessing of elections and actually taking part in them. It sounds like you do some of that with young people, and I think that's terrific work. We need to do more of that. So,
Yanidsi, you want to add to that as well?
Sure. Because I have worked in the last 15 years on the voter registration, voter education campaigns, grassroots, mostly in Southeast area. I have seen the combination of elements where young voters really wants to get out to vote. Like here, our panelists just mentioned, it's about access. And we go back to that same word, but with a young crowd, I will say that the young voters in particular, sometimes they are not used to the process and they are new. So what we're talking about is specifically those that are voting for the first time or the first midterm election or for the first presidential election between the 17th and the 25 years old that they have, and they forgot to register to vote, or they forgot to update their voter registration information, or they just simply did not gather all the information so they felt confident to go out and vote. I think the access it's important because right now, since the 2012 Vietnam displaced those states, voter registration on a voter election day, is available. But yet, it does comes with some limitations. It has to go to the specific place that has been designated by the town. In addition to that, when we go to early voting, this young crowd are in college. They are probably working or traveling, and they miss that absentee ballot, which it's very strict, right? Very specific to the needs that a voter can apply for. And again, you are not giving them all the range of opportunities for them to be part of it. And they're very aware of that. And I think that is why they're paying attention to forums and all the candidates when they are doing town halls. But really, they need more access than information. But at the same level, it's at the same level because what he said, it's education in the school. It's so important and so crucial to make sure that we are preparing those young voters for success.
Absolutely. Steve, one of the things that, I know you've been very interested in is in the fact, the demographics of communities of color, Latino community, but others. The fact that in the Latino community, for example, it's one of the youngest, right? Demographically, and there are other communities that are as well. So the question about voter education, civic engagement, and all that is relevant. Can you add something about that?
The close sibling to civic engagement is leadership. And one thing that we deny young people, perhaps because of muscle memory, but also because of a lack of trust, are opportunities to lead, even before they are enfranchised with the ability to vote. What's remarkable about young people is this moment when young people access the tools of leadership and the notion of leadership, the ability to lead, right? The trust in leadership. They do it, and they lead on things that they're passionate about. And they're not all passionate about the same thing, but they do lead. And that's what's remarkable. So trust young people to lead, and they will understand that civic engagement starts way before they're enfranchised to vote. They will be eager to vote when the time comes. But also that access, you know, when you talk about the younger demographics of emerging populations in the state, I have to say the same thing. There is a muscle memory to leadership that we, you know, when you and I look on a screen or we look at the halls of power and decision making, there's a muscle memory even in our own eyes to what we expect to see, right? Where are the leaders from? What is their pedigree? Whatever it is that you call that. What is their education? We need to expand our muscle memory so that we start seeing more and more diversity among our expectations of the leaders that are at the head of the table. That diversity has to be demographic, linguistic, so that we commit to leadership in ways that we haven't expected ourselves to in the past.
Absolutely. So it's a lot of factors. You know, the mentoring also is important, and also young people seeing young candidates also, because they usually see these older people. Not to criticize them. Joe, you want to add something? Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and I think civics education is a perfect opportunity for that. And I think to some extent we're missing that opportunity right now. And I think so. Just as an example, one of the assignments I give my students every year is a Civics in Action project, and they actually have to go out and experience democracy at some level. I think that's not happening often enough, and I think one of the reasons for that is there's concern on the part of either teachers or parents that that's risky business, that maybe you're crossing the line a little bit if you're a teacher and you're asking your students to go and participate. I think, on the contrary, we need our students to become leaders at an early age, and civics education doesn't mean it has to be partisan activity. So when I ask my students to be involved in civic education, I'm asking them to go take part as a leader in their community. And I totally agree with what you said about young people. Young people are incredible, and if you put the bar high in front of them, they will jump to meet it. And so one of the things my students led couple of years ago was a debate between two candidates running for the House of Representatives, and then 2 years later for state Senate. The students collaborated with the League of Women Voters. They met regularly after school. They invited the candidates in. They came up with the questions, and they hosted a debate in front of 100 members of the community. Those students are going to be voters, and they're really passionate about the process now. It's an incredible opportunity, and they were freshmen. These are freshmen, and they were totally in charge. We need to do more of that. I think one thing I just want to add to this is I believe nationally there's not a single state that mandates in their curriculum experiential learning in civics education. I'd like Connecticut to be the first. We should have experiential learning. It should be part of the process, and I think we can raise the bar that way.
And it's part of what you said, Steve, about muscle memory, to getting used to being exposed to civic engagement as an important part of your life. I want to invite Doris, if you want to add something, Doris.
Yes, I also co-taught as a teacher civics, and I'll dip into that in the next question. But how do our youth see themselves included and directly impacted besides the latest social media trend? We have in Connecticut CT Casa, which is Kids as Self-Advocates. These are youth from 13 to 26 with disabilities that learn about their rights and responsibilities and how to become self-advocates. These young people have testified at the LOB in DC and have also testified in the police accountability. They've educated medical providers. So we have resources that are siloed, but we have youth already setting and paving the waves and setting the path. We just have to expand on that. I was told recently by leaders that children should not participate in their own educational meetings. Children of all abilities can communicate, and it's essential to empower them and their voice so that they grow aware of their choice. It's the law. I've taken my children since they were the age of 5, I have a 5-year-old that just went with me to vote and register recently. And it's especially significant if we are voting at their schools, at their districts, so that they can make that connection and include them in their own school meetings, empower their voice. And at the IEP, at the PPT, at the 504, at the parent-teacher conferences, it's the law. And so allow them to do so, invite them to do so. Culturally, as a first-generation Puerto Rican, I was taught that children should be seen and not heard. And I've done the contrary with my children. They have been involved in their educational careers, in their political careers, and they've learned the difference between civic responsibility and privilege. And it's essential to do that.
Thank you, Doris. Before we move from this topic, Joe, just a question. How does Connecticut compare to other states in terms of civics education? I think I know the answer, but I want you to elaborate on that, please.
I hope I have the numbers right. I think there's 9 states in the country that require a full year of civics education in order to graduate. I believe there's something like 31 that require a half year. Connecticut's one of those states that requires a half year of civics education in order to graduate. And then the other 10 states don't have a requirement. That doesn't mean they're not doing it. At the local level, they might be, but they might not. And that was the case for Connecticut until around 2014. And the previous Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, was actually one of the big proponents of that civics education that became law, which was a great step forward for young people. So Connecticut is definitely there. I think what Connecticut needs to do more of is I guess here's sort of the change that I would like to see. I work in a social studies department, and in order to be certified and teach in a social studies department, you have to have a history degree. But I think to teach, and I don't think someone with a history degree can't teach a civics course effectively, but why aren't we allowing college graduates with a political science degree to be teachers of civics? I think that curriculum lends itself in that direction. So I would like to see more opportunity for a larger number of people who have background in politics to be able to be in the classroom teaching. I think that would be a great step forward. And personally, I think if you think about all the things you really cover in a good civics class, founding documents and the Justice Department, the Constitution, important Supreme Court cases through history, the way the legislative branch works, how a bill becomes a law. You start talking about all that and media literacy, which I think even more today than ever has to be part of civics education. Covering that in a half a year is a lot to ask. And so I think I would love to see more of a civics requirement, either a year or build it into other courses. But I think that's where we have room to grow. And also with the civics in action style learning as well, because I think the content has to be there. Definitely, people have to know their democracy, but I think they also have to experience it.
Engage it.
Yes, and I think there has to be more of a push for that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Joe, because I've had many conversations with my friend, Stephen Armstrong. I'm sure you know him. He's the coordinator for social studies for Connecticut, and he's a member of the Civic Health Advisor Group. And two things he said is, one is that the curriculum needs to be more open to action civics or hands-on civic. But also he talked about how in many places in Connecticut, teachers are afraid to teach on the presidential election, especially the 2016 election, because of what was going on with the campaigns, right? And so what advice would you give to teachers and to parents also, because parents have a lot of influence on that, so that they understand that it's so important for young people to be aware of and understand that talking about elections doesn't have to be partisan. It can be just learning about it.
So a lot to say here. So first, Stephen Armstrong is amazing.
Yeah.
We're lucky to have him in Connecticut. And he has been a big proponent of the Red, White, and Blue Schools program. The Red, White, and Blue Schools program is a collaboration between the State Department of Education and the Secretary of State's office. And what they do is
the Connecticut Democracy Center.
And the Connecticut of course. And what they do is they network with teachers all throughout the state to sort of create a healthy competition between schools around teaching civics education. I just got an email from the State Department about an upcoming opportunity to work for with the Red, White, and Blue Schools program. That's amazing. We need more of that. When, you know, and I should also say, you know, thinking here also about Doris's comment about bringing young people to vote.
Yeah.
My wife is here today. We just brought our 5-year-old to go and vote too. So I love that we're exactly. So that's terrific. And I think we have to encourage parents to encourage their young people to go to the polls and vote as well. But I'm trying to circle back to the question you had also had was about
teacher being afraid to.
Yeah, that's a really challenging issue. I've heard, I feel really lucky because I teach at a school where my department head, my principal they've really encouraged me to push the civics in action work that I do, the experiential learning. But I know that's not the case at every school. I think the advice that I'd give, you know, to parents is reach out to your civics teachers and encourage them to do that sort of work and support them when they're doing it. I think the advice that I'd give to teachers is that I think it helps to be proactive and transparent. So if you know that you want to implement like a civic activity in your classroom, reach out to your administration ahead of time, let them know why you're doing it, let them know how it connects to the curriculum. And similarly with parents, let them know the reason for the work that you're doing and be clear that it's not because it's partisan work. We're not trying to impart a political perspective with our students. We're trying to help them understand our democracy. And we're sort of tying our hands behind our back if we're trying to do that without going and experiencing that democracy. So.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think parents play a key role because some parents are going to be going to the teachers and complaining, why are you teaching about this or that? If you have parents who say the opposite, then that's a way of supporting teachers so that they are not only hearing the negative, but they're also hearing the positive. And school districts will pay attention to that. If they only hear about parents who are complaining about how we shouldn't teach this in the classroom and not the other message, they're going to listen to that message, right? So I think that that's important. We're getting close to the end, I think, but I do have one more question to ask Doris because I think this is an important topic, you know. How do we provide access to people with challenges and disabilities? And one thing is, unless people have a relative or a close friend who has a disability or a physical, emotional, mental challenge, most Connecticut residents don't know they know very little or they don't know enough about the voting laws, right, that protect and provide for voters with disabilities. And I have a question for you, Doris. What are some unique hurdles that people with disabilities in Connecticut face and what laws exist to protect them? And then how does Connecticut compare with other states on that?
Sorry. That is a tall order to try to squeeze in, and I'll try to do my best. With 1 in 4 people nationally impacted by a disability, many of us may not be familiar with our rights, and neither are those working at the polls. So as co-chair of the Keep the Promise Coalition that I mentioned before, I can boast that we've been successful with providing a free virtual training that I've coined Voting While Disabled. Yeah. There are others that the council has funded, the Connecticut Developmental Disabilities Council has funded throughout the years. But knowing that knowing the law and protections are the hurdle. In Connecticut, but in statute, people with an intellectual disability have the right to vote unless a probate court has specifically ruled that they are incompetent to exercise that right. Now, Connecticut law does allow the supervising officials at the polls the authority to reject a ballot when they are unable to determine how the voter wants to vote. So it's at the discretion of the officials at the polls. This seems so subjective, but in statute, I've heard horrific stories where our people, my people, people with IDD, or nonverbal people are turned away. So there's no constitutional disqualification provision. Persons under hospitalization or treatment for psychiatric disabilities may vote unless such patient has been declared specifically incapable of voting and appointed a conservator. In addition to these statutes, This should be included in the ADA disability plan for every town. Every town is supposed to have an ADA plan. So first, contact your town and ask. We have several rights that are established to accessible polling place. Accommodations can be made if we have difficulty standing in line. We have the right to use a ballot marking device. We have the right to vote independently and privately. We have the right to receive assistance when casting our ballot. We have the right to review a sample ballot and receive instructions concerning how to operate the voting equipment before voting. We can request curbside voting if we become temporarily incapacitated when we arrive at the polling place. We have the right to vote by absentee ballot. Voters with print disabilities have the right to request accommodations. We can participate in supervised absentee voting if we reside in a nursing home, assisted living, or other qualified institution. We can obtain permanent absentee voter status if we have a permanent disability. Voters with permanent disabilities can apply to our town clerks for permanent absentee ballot status. We can obtain an emergency absentee ballot if we are suddenly injured, taken ill, or have been hospitalized within 6 days of the election. Only a judge or probate can decide whether or not we are competent to vote. So my question in all of those rights that we have and have had for quite some time, we're asking our voters, asking our voters directly if they need assistance, and we can go into that later on, but how that needs to be improved.
Thank you so much, Doris. How does Connecticut compare to other states, though? I'm curious.
That would be subjective. I can't tell you how we compare to other states. I've had national conversations, and although we're a small but mighty state, it's been disappointing as I reflected back on what happened in COVID, where we were sent back and disqualified, discredited, and disenfranchised for being disabled. We have definitely rural areas, because I'm from the city. I was born and bred in the city, so I tend to work in urban areas. But now I'm working in rural areas, and they suffer the same inequities and disabilities or lack of access and transportation that we do in the cities. So we could do a better job, definitely.
That's what I thought. Thank you so much, Doris. We're getting close to the end of the panel. I do have one final question for each of the panelists. Why is voting so important to the health of our democracy? Steve?
As a federal republic, we actually are, by agreement, a collection of democracies. And each one of our states has the ability to perfect and improve upon access to our democracy in the state in which we live. Each one of our states has that solemn duty, in fact. So the reason that it's so important is because it really does, they say all politics is local, but all civics is every day. And unless we commit to civic engagement, it will be virtually impossible to continue in the social contract that we have all agreed to, and that we continue to perfect and re-energize every year.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Steve. Yanidsi?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Why is democracy so important? Why is voting so important for democracy? I apologize.
Okay. Well, first of all, regardless of how you came or if you were born in United States, democracy is what it makes United States so beautiful. It's really one of the blessings that we have to fight every day, and we cannot forget who fought for democracy before us. But regardless, it is important every single day, because every day there are decisions that impact individuals, families, neighborhood communities, the state, the nation. And we need to be aware of those changes. We need to be aware and be part of those decisions. We cannot sit on the sidelines and wait for things to happen and then react to it. So civics and democracy, like Stephen said, somehow it's intrinsic with everything that we do and for everything that we work for. And it's important that we need to provide the installments in our children and future generation so they value the work and also protect their future through that. Because it's a system that ensures the opportunity for everyone to have a right to raise their voice and to be heard.
Gracias. Thank you, Yanidsi. Joe.
Yeah, so we are a government of, for, and by the people. And in order for that government to flourish, we have to have participation from the citizenry. And one of the things that hasn't come up at all yet in the discussion is making sure that our citizens are informed voters. Of course, education is the purpose of that, but not only do we need to go beyond just voting, but we need to make sure that we have informed voters. And so literacy in our democracy is really important to that. But certainly the problems that we're facing today are solvable, but only if we're participating at high levels in a thoughtful way.
Exactly. Doris.
Because it's the law. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, disabled people, and older adults have historically experienced and continue to experience systemic discrimination. We face pervasive negative biases and inaccurate assumptions about our viability, value, quality of life, capacity to communicate and make decisions. There's a tendency to group all persons who experience disability as if we were members of a homogenous group, and we're not. The council has empowered self-direction, self-determination, and person-centered services so that we may enter the workforce and any force in meaningful and gratifying employment as individuals living with inalienable rights to live liberty, liberty, and the pursuit of felicidad in our own homes and communities. There's nothing about us without us, and nada sobre nosotros. And I wanted to conclude my testimony today, and quoting Justice Sonia Sotomayor. There are uses to adversity, and they don't reveal themselves until tested. Whether it's serious illness, financial hardship, or the simple constraint of parents who speak limited English, difficulty can tap unexpected strengths. We need to be united once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Thank you very much. Before I again thank the panelists, I just want to mention how important it is, and you mentioned to be informed as a voter. There will be a constitutional amendment question, right, on the ballot on November 8th. It is so important that everyone be informed about that, and you can choose yes or no. If you choose yes, that will authorize the Connecticut General Assembly next year to begin the process of developing a voter early voting program for Connecticut. If you say no, that won't happen. We won't have early voting. And Connecticut is in the company right now of 4 states that don't have early voting, and 2 of them have been some of the most negative states or most adverse states with access to voting, Alabama and Mississippi, right? Especially for people of color. New Hampshire is the other state. We need to change that, right? To make voting more accessible so that people can vote early before Election Day. And let me just thank the panelists again, Steve, Hernandez, Yanidsi, Joe, and also Doris. Please, let's give them a round of applause. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I know, Mariana, do we have time for questions? Okay.
Are running a little bit short on time, but if anybody does have any questions, raise your hand and I'll come over to you with the mic. And also everybody who's watching online, you can post your questions in the comment section of the video. Anybody? No? Let me check the stream real quick. Maybe we didn't miss any questions. Nope. Okay, looks like we are good.
No questions here from the audience? Well, oh, the gentleman there, yes.
Thank you. I wouldn't want to waste this beautiful venue if we have a few minutes. My name is Walter Glom. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Council on Developmental Disabilities, which means I work for Doris. I just wanted to make a couple comments that maybe Stephen and our civics teacher can respond perhaps. One is on this issue of state-to-state comparisons. You know, as a director of a council that's federally funded, I have counterparts in every state and territory, and we're often wrestling with this state-to-state thing. State-to-state comparisons are diabolical. They're extremely difficult to do, in part because, as Stephen pointed out, you know, every state is its own little world, and we do things differently. But on this issue, I would, and we just simply don't have a lot of the data, as Doris, I think, said. But on this issue, I would stay away from that and simply, you know, assert that, you know, this is a right. I mean, it's an absolute right, you know, that's essential to our existence. So our standard should not be, you know, where are we relative to anywhere else in the country? It's a standard is absolute, right? If there's one person who doesn't have access, you know, to their franchise, I mean, that we have to fix that. So, I mean, that's where we have to go with this, I think. And as Doris pointed out, we have, at least for people with disabilities, we have some pretty strong laws and regulations, you know, that ostensibly ensure access and accommodations. The issue is implementation. So one of the things I think we need to address in our parent training and in teaching our students is what are the remedies? Okay? I mean, when you see an injustice, you know, when you see something that's wrong, what do you do about it? And we get calls, you know, too many calls of people who go to a voting place, ask for an accommodation, ask for the special machine, and the answer is, yeah, we have that, but it's still in the box. Yeah, we have that, but we're not trained to use it. Yeah, we have that, but it's on the other side of town. You know, that's unacceptable. So, you know, people need to know, well, what do you do then, right? Who do you call, right? What's the remedy? Because it's one thing to state these things and say, oh, we got a law, we've got a regulation, it's a right. And people should know their rights. But then the question is, what do you do about it? And that's, you know, that accountability piece is something I hope we can do more with going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So,
Thank you so much.
Mariana, unless there's no other questions, I don't think, turn it over to you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. That was wonderful. Val, thank you for great moderation. And to all of our speakers, thank you so much for your expertise and your time here today. And also thank you everybody who came down in person and also everybody who's watching online. This is the last in the Untangling the Tally series, and we're very, very happy with how this program, the series has turned out. And yeah, I also want to, before we wrap up, thank our partners from CTN who have been running the stream and recording everything. Who've been doing a wonderful job. So thank you very much to them. And yeah, awesome. I hope you had a wonderful time here today and enjoy the rest of your day.